This is a Power 98.7 podcast. Now we're talking. Subscribe to Power 98.7 podcasts in iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. There's more on power987.co.za.
And as we do on a Monday, it is a view of the nation. So it started off with questions and answers in Parliament in the last week, where the head of the EFF, the Commander-in-Chief, raised the question with the President and said, would you elaborate and explain where are the 1 million houses you promised the people of Alexandra? And of course, there was a lot of banter back and forth. And Twitter investigators came to the fore and said, no, here are video clips of the President actually using the words 1 million homes in Alexandra Township. So there's no need for spin to sort of say, no, it was a promise of 1 million houses in South Africa. It was in the context of Alexandra as a town or a place in Johannesburg. Then the President then responded and said, okay, I was wrong. He apologized and recognized that there's a spatial issue in Alexandra, that even in practical terms, 1 million homes are not possible to build in Alexandra. There's simply not enough space. Okay, so that's at the political level. Now let's talk at the urban planning and statistical level, the census level. We're told that Alexandra Township has about 500,000 people living in it. And just for context, Soweto, which is massive in terms of its expanse, width and expanse, Soweto has about 2.5 million people living in it, or slightly less. Okay, so 1/4 of the Soweto population is found in this place called Alexandra. And Alexandra only has about 800 hectares of land. So 800 hectares of land, 500,000 people. That's not a lot of houses that can be built. So how do you provide services for this community? And then the final statistic I want to throw out at you. We're told that, regardless of the fact that Eskom's done a huge job to electrify Alexandra and some roads have been built since 1994, the infrastructure, water, pipes, sewage in Alexandra can only really realistically cater for about 70,000 people. 500,000 people live there. The infrastructure's capacity is for 70,000 people, and we're talking 800 hectares of land mass. So what needs to be done to fix Alexandra and give the people of Alexandra the services that they need? And this is now not a money issue. This is a how do you use that money issue when you've got the constraints that you have of space, geographical space, municipal services, and needing to provide adequate facilities. We are joined by Raisa Sumar, the director of Sumar & Co. He's a professional town planner. Good morning, Raisa.
Good morning. How are you?
Fine, thank you, ma'am. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me on your show.
It's our pleasure. Dumsani Baleni is also here. He is the Gauteng Communications Officer for the EFF. Good morning.
Good morning, Lorato, and good morning to the viewers and the other
the listeners.
Yeah,
Thank
the
you.
listeners and the panelists. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We also have Professor Hope Magidimisha Chipungu. Did I say that correctly? Professor
Yes.
Chipungu.
Yes.
Okay. Do I say Magidimisha Chipungu? Double-barreled. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you so much for coming through, Professor. Dumsani, let's start with you, because obviously the big exchange, the discourse began with the EFF challenging the president, not just in Parliament last week, but consistently, even before the elections, to say, can you clarify your position on housing in Alexandra? We now know that the president has apologized. He should never have used the term 1 million houses in Alexandra, and he recognizes that there's just not enough space. But why was this an important issue for the EFF consistently to raise?
Well, simply because in the first place, the people of Alexandra are living in very, very seriously, painful conditions that are not supposed to be tolerated in the new dispensation, in the democratic dispensation. And the fact that the people of Alexandra have been promised houses. Remember, before the president Ramaphosa went back to Alexandra, the people of Alexandra were promised a project of Alexandra Renewal as one of the oldest townships in the country, one of the highly populated townships. There was a promise and there was a funding of billions to say there must be an Alexandra Renewal. At some point, some people were moved to a place called Deep Sloot. So that is a very important issue for the EFF, and the fact that they are just opposite where they are living is Sentin, where people are basking in luxuries and riches, whereas the people of Alexandra don't have places to stay. And therefore the EFF has taken serious what the president of the ANC has been saying, and also what the ANC has said even in the previous time. And we are really concerned and very much, we take very much the issue of land and the issue of housing in the society.
Okay, so thank you for reminding us of the 2009 Alexandra Renewal Project, and something that was meant to accelerate integrated sustainable development around 8 nodes in the country, Alexandra being one of them, and it has quite a few component aspects to it, from housing to electrification to rehabilitating general infrastructure, and over a 7-year period it was estimated to cost 1.3 billion rands. What do you know about what's happened to that project since? Is it still very much in the pipeline, or do you think it's just been abandoned? Dumsani.
The project has really disappeared into the thin air, as we understand. There's not been any accountability. There's been, if you remember, in 2021, the then public protector sanctioned that the SIU have an investigation on the Alexandra Renewal Project. But there's not been any accountability. Instead, we have seen that the leaders of the ANC that were involved in the project have now been elevated to positions of leadership. Otherwise, there's not been any renewal in Alexandra. There's not been any rehabilitation. There's not been any major electrification or connection of the people to basic amenities. The project is abandoned. It has disappeared into the thin air. Part of the problems about the issue of Alexandra.
Okay, and then let's deal with the practicals, Dumsani, and then I'll hand over to the urban planners. I mean, regardless of what anybody says, the truth of the matter is there's just not enough land mass in Alexandra. There's a lot of density, a lot of people live there, but just not enough land to house them all. If you could suggest a solution, what would you say?
Well, first of all, there is a land that is not far from Alexandra that is said to be belonging to the Wits University. And there's been conversations about why isn't Wits and the state, getting into conversation about the land, because it's not being used. And we see if we cannot, start a conversation of building houses for the people of Alexandra. But also in the aspect of planning, I think the planners would know better that there are ways of building. You can build going up. You can do a lot of things. There are creative ways of planning now that ordinarily were not there before. That could still be able to, allow us to accommodate the people of Alexandra. The fact of the matter is that there will always be this question of unavailability of land. Whereas there is land in South Africa, there is land in Gauteng as we speak. There's vacant land. There's land that even people in communities around even decide because of the length or the longevity as to how they've been, vacant, how the land has been vacant. People decide to occupy it. Instead of allowing people or letting people to be agitated to get to a point where they want to occupy the land, why is there no conversation around land, around the vacant land, around the housing of the people, around the reality of our people, not only in Alexandra, across Gauteng? There's a lot of dense populated areas just opposite vacant land that is not being used. Those are questions that the country needs to speak about, and those are questions that EFF has been speaking about since 2013, since our establishment. Those are things that we think even those who are planning, even those who are into positions of power should engage into, and be very truthful about the state of the people of Alexandra and Gauteng in general.
Okay, I'm going to say something to provoke you, but I want you to respond. So I remember a time shortly before 1994, where Alexandra didn't have any electricity at all. That's actually why it was called the Dark City. And now there's been major electrification. Some roads have been fixed. We even drive on London Road through Alexandra to get to Bramley to use as they say, a double up, to avoid the highway. So there've been some modest improvements in the infrastructure in Alexandra. Certainly more is needed. But would you acknowledge that something has happened to shift the situation in Alexandra, or do you say no, that doesn't count?
Well, there's been efforts, but we don't think they are significant because they are not around the question of land in Alexandra. They are not considering the fact that there should be a movement of people, not just try to electrify and put everything in a very congested place. There's a question of land that has not been answered in the aspect of Alexandra. There are things that have been done, but they are insignificant, to be honest. That is why even today you find an EFF councillor, trying to assist people to occupy the transitional homes in Alexandra, and he got shot and he lost his life because there's still a very urgent issue of land in Alexandra that has not been attended to, besides just electrifying people and giving them water.
Okay, fantastic. We thank you for your inputs, Tumsani Baleni. Let's now defer to the urban planners. Thank you for your time. Raisa Suma, you've heard what the EFF have had to say about this issue. It's been a very, very important issue in terms of their politics and how they engage issues nationally and provincially. And they've given their reasons coherently why we need to have a particular focus on Alexandra Township. We shouldn't just make it a generalized program in the IDPs, but Alexandra needs a program of its own because there's a desperate need for housing, land, and managing the spatial challenges in this part of Johannesburg, but also how this then impacts broader utilities and services. So I don't know if you've looked at Alexandra as an urban planner and had some thoughts about it.
I mean, I couldn't agree more with the EFF stance that there's an urgent need to, formalize housing, to provide high quality accommodation for people, which would ultimately improve their quality of life. As far as the availability of land is concerned, I mean, Alex is one of the most densely populated spaces in the city of Johannesburg. That is a given. The amount of people per square meter is just exorbitant. So, I mean, we need to then start thinking creatively about how can we provide housing for people. My thing is, densification can be done through multi-story developments where, the number of people that can be accommodated in a smaller space is just so much better. And the idea of ownership needs to be also changed with people's mindsets. I think that, creating high density spaces where we create walk-up developments, we create flats and apartments, where it's sectionalized and people own, their unit as opposed to the land, but they still have ownership of the space. So, through the idea of having that specific ownership, people take care of the space, they commit themselves to making sure that the space is well maintained and all of that. So I think that can be a solution in terms of housing provision. Yeah. But of course, that also comes with its own difficulties in terms of maintenance. Something that's not popularized in low-cost housing is these sectionalized units, because there's no levies, or there's like a minimal levy that's being paid to a body where the maintenance would then be taken care of. So oftentimes, the government provides these type of solutions, but then it's not long-term, there's no longevity in it. So, those are solutions that can be done by the community where ownership is taken from within themselves.
Yeah. Okay.
And then the services, obviously, we need to consider alternative energy. We need to consider rainwater harvesting. all of those type of solutions can be done simultaneously to create better living environments.
Yeah. Let's bring in Professor Hope Magdimisha Chipungu here. And I know that you are a professor at the University of KZN, but the province has also had to deal with many issues of how you resettle, house, and offer affordable housing. Now, even if, for instance, there is a concerted effort to build upwards, in other words, sectional title apartment blocks, we're told that the utilities infrastructure in Alexandra is a problem, that the capacity to provide municipal services only serves about 70,000 people. And as a result, they constantly have problems in Alexandra like fires because of illegal connections. They have problems like in the last financial year, 1,300 sewage drains blocked because of utility problems and water problems. And they've also got, the density that we're talking about. 102 families could be living in a yard. And that was something that was actually brought forward before the South African Human Rights Commission. So there are a lot of these kinds of additional issues in Alexandra.
Yes, I fully agree with my colleagues who spoke earlier to say the issue around Alexandra is an agent and it needs an agent solution. So I agree more with that. I also agree with the concept of densification. But perhaps what we want to do to able to understand the issue of Alexandra is take a step back and say why Alexandra is the way it is. Why do we have so many people in Alexandra? And people, the profile of people in Alexandra, they're coming from different provinces. Most of them coming from rural areas, coming to Johannesburg to try to survive. But we do know that our cities in South Africa are very expensive. Most people, ordinary South Africans, are not able to survive within our cities. Now, if you want to deal with the issues of Alexandra, you cannot deal with issues of Alexandra alone, because focusing on Alexandra specifically alone, you are dealing with what we call symptoms of a bigger problem that we have in the country. We have a country which has cities which are not equal in terms of infrastructure development, of course, and with the resources and economic activity. So there's a view and a notion that Johannesburg, that's the hub economic, which used to be the case anyway. But as time goes on, Johannesburg has lost some of its activities, economic activities. So it's not able to sustain people. Now, what are we supposed to do, therefore? We're supposed to distribute the resources across the country to make sure that if you look at a country like Northern Cape, province like Northern Cape, you will realize that there's quite a bit of land and very few people there. What development is going there? So we need to distribute our resources across the country to make sure that people do not feel the need to be in Alexandra or to be in Johannesburg. People now, they feel the need to be in Johannesburg because that's where economic activities are. So I think that's another angle that we need to look at it. The other issue we need to treat is the issue around the land. If you look at the report that was produced by Department of Rural Development, you will realize that most of the land in South Africa is in the hands of the private sector. And here I'm not talking about land. I'm talking about what we consider prime land. We're talking about the productive land, the land we can use for people to settle. Now, how do we then start a meaningful process where we're able to acquire that land so that we're able to help people with South Africa? The amount of land that we have in South Africa, which is in the hands of government, most of it, including the hands of ordinary South Africans, is not prime land. So therefore, it's not able to trade in the higher value as compared to the one in the private sector. So, and we need to look into it.
Okay. We're almost going to be just catching a breath with the news headlines, but I'll just take some brief comments from Alexandra. And Tate Jan, good morning.
Hey guys.
Quickly, go ahead.
Kikupa utlhalosa ka suit. Into ngwanaka ke ka ukupa ka re teng rena batswadi ba rena ba Onan Alexandra. Re ditse re le tlhalosetse Alexandra ke batswadi ba re batho ba le ba buang EFF or government ba buang a se batho ba Alexandra ba ba re kwe black ya rena Alexandra ya batswadi ba bona because the title deed batswadi ba rena ba santse ba na le tsona di bitsa bona batho ba aba bulele a le ba kwetsena ka title deed ya batswadi ba e rekisitswe ko mang ara rekisetsa city council ara rekisetsa government still our title deed is batswadi ba rena the grandparents tsa rena please tlhalosang Alexandra hantle re teng batho bana ba Alexandra re teng Alexandra ke batswadi ba rena ba sa ba bua maka di political parties ba ba bua maka ko Johannesburg City Council e seng ka Alexandra please Alexandra ke ya rena batswadi ba rena batho ba tletseng ba ha se batho ba Alexandra ke ba ipegi ka skuto ba beile ke AC ke DA defend. That's all.
Okay. So if nka toloka ntho buang ntate yan uri Alexander ina le batho ba bangata because batho ba bangata ba dulang ko Alexander are not the original inhabitants of Alexander. And the original inhabitants of Alexander, bana linked the title deeds from generation to generation, are now being overrun by people who've come in and are living informally. And as a result, they are putting pressure on the services and the utilities tsa Alexander. And so if we're going to discuss housing and resettlement, it must be people who are not originally from Alexander. They can be moved to a different part of Joburg.
Yeah, how about I get it. I get about Wucha ko parliament, ba Wucha kai di political party. Haba ban parliament serena, rena kai develop by Alexander.
Okay. Thank you. Ndate Yang, very fiery there, saying we should not have a spatial planning population density issue in Alexander. If you go back to the original owners of the homes, of the land, the people with the title deeds, then you wouldn't have 102 families dwelling in one yard, because those 102 families must be relocated somewhere else with dignity in other parts of Johannesburg, but they should not overrun Alexander, and he blames politicians for doing that. We'll continue in a moment.
Lerato Mbele on Power 98.7.
It's 11:34, and thank you for staying with us. We're talking about how to fix Alexander. Now, the politicians have obviously had a lot to say to each other. That's fine. And it happened in Parliament, and point scoring and cheap shots and whatever else. That's fine. But if we go beyond the politics and let's just deal with the reality of the situation on the ground. Nobody's wrong here. The president is right to say there's an urgent need for housing in Alexander. It's just his mathematics is not right. The EFF is right to say, when are you going to address the urban renewal of Alexander? It's been an issue spoken about since 2001 when President Mbeki was president. That's when the Alex Renewal Project was introduced. And at the time, in 2001, it was valued at 1.3 billion. So I don't know if we make an inflation adjustment for 2024, what an urban renewal project would be valued at. They are not wrong to raise that issue. The people of Alexander are now in the middle of all of it, while some politicians try to score points and others try to point out the weaknesses in policy. But the truth of the matter is they need services urgently. They need housing urgently. And what I've read, and I'm not a spatial planner, is that the need is so dire that there are 500,000 people who live in Alexander. 500,000 people live in Alexander. But land mass wise, Alexander is only 800 hectares. We've got an urban planner here. She can tell us what that is. I think it's sort of 3.5 kilometers long, 5 kilometers wide, or not even 3 kilometers wide. So we're not talking about a huge surface area. So how do you fix for a place that has such dire need for housing, for water, for sewage, for refuse collection? How do you make it work? And we're in conversation with Professor Hope Magidimisha Chipungu from UKZN, and we also have Raisa Sumar, a town planner. Nyiko, you've also got something to say.
There are people in Alex, but there are also people from Alex, and these two are different. And the people who are generally the owners of Alexander, they're sitting well, the properties suit them, they are no problem. Problem but is the politician. But I want to also answer this thing to say the 1.3 billion that was allocated for Alex, it did work. Remember, there were people who were moved from the Joskei River to establish a town or a smaller township just outside Soweto called Bramfisher. That township was developed with part of that money. And I don't know how much it cost to build a township, but it's a lot of money. Another money was taken to Deep Sloot. Look at how big Deep Sloot is, the bulk infrastructure and everything else. That money was taken there as well. Some of the monies was used to build schools. We have 5 new schools in Alex, 5 new primary schools and 4 new high schools. And a lot has been done. So these political parties, they're taking swipes at each other at our expense. And as the people of Alex, the real people of Alex, our voice has been silenced by politicians because they come in with these big monies and these big crowds and they make noise and they overrun the landowners. And that's our problem there. Thank you.
Okay, so Nyeko, echoing the sentiments of Ndati Young, saying, why is there a spatial density, population density problem? Is because somehow the politicians have sold to migrant workers the idea that Alexandra can absorb them, whereas they should be absorbed in other parts of South Africa. Nobody has said people mustn't come from Limpopo or KZN or anywhere else northwest to work in Johannesburg. That's not what the residents of Alexandra are saying. They're saying, why has it been made easy for them to settle in a place that really and truly can't house them appropriately? Why couldn't they be taken elsewhere to live? So that Alexandra, which has a capacity to provide services for 77,000 people, would service 77,000 people, not 500,000 people. Prince, your view?
And to your guests, whilst I concur with what the gentleman, Unyeko, was saying, and the previous gentleman had said, my issue, I'm going to look at it from the technical perspective. You've got Marlborough alongside Alexandra. A section of Marlborough that has derelict factories that nobody is using to the advantage of trying to grow Alexandra into. On the other side, the opposite side, where you spoke of London Road actually encroached. The growing of that street was actually an encroachment into Alexandra. A lot of yards were actually cut off to try and make way for that road. Opposite that, you've got derelict factories. They've been derelict for quite a while. There was a question as to why is it that you're insisting on cutting on land that is very small, as opposed to actually trying to grow this road onto those derelict factories. So there actually has not been, both from an engineering perspective and from a political perspective, there has not been an incentive to actually do what is good for Alexandra.
Okay. Thanks, Ntate Prince. Just saying people are paying lip service. Politicians pay lip service to the story of Alexandra. Professor Hope, let's start with you, just responding to some of the things that residents of Alexandra are saying in their own words.
Yeah, no, I think they're raising very key issues, and I think I've started touching on it to say, if you look at the profile of people in Alexandra, it's a mixed bag of people coming from different places or different provinces. And that's where the problem is. We need to deal with that. Because even if we just say we are going to solve the Alexandra issues now as it is, without solving why the status quo it is, then there's a problem. There is unequal development across the country, which needs to be addressed. Because even if we can spend a whole year talking about these issues, but people won't stop moving to go to Alexandra or to the areas where they think it's cheaper for them to survive. So we need to address that part. So I think that's quite key, what they're saying. And also, you are making a point that in terms of the infrastructure, availability of infrastructure in Alexandra, we must remember that every time when you come up with a development, you need to do that development needs to be followed by infrastructure which will support the population, but the infrastructure in place. So if there's a need to go for densification, like what my colleagues said there on, it will then mean that you have to adjust the infrastructure. You cannot keep the same pathway to the one which you carry away your sewer system and all that, which is accommodating only 70,000 people, which have 500,000 people. So I think there's a need to also talk about not just housing, but infrastructure But not only that, we also need to talk about the lived environment as part of its own totality, where people go to school, the clinics, because that has a triple effect on almost everything. If you look at a person's life, household's life, what do they need? Where do they go for the entertainment? Where do they go for schooling their children and the entertainment? And the list go on. So there's a massive adjustment needs to happen. If it happens, it's just about housing. Thank you.
Okay. Raisa Sumar, the people of Alexandra have said what they need to say about where you resettle, how people are absorbed when they come and work in Johannesburg. And those become political issues. So I'm not going to ask you to have a view politically, but I'm going to ask you to have a view as an urban planner. So one of the things that always surprised me is that Johannesburg has the largest concentration of people living in it, right? I think 33% of the population of the country lives in Johannesburg. And yet Joburg is one of the smallest provinces. So Joburg, or Gauteng rather, is one of the smallest provinces. So you've got 1/3 of the population coming to live and work and seek out an opportunity here. But this isn't exactly the biggest space. So even if we spoke about finding different parcels of land, and I know you've spoken about private owners, Gauteng just has a problem in general, does it not?
So the first thing that we need to understand that even though Joburg is the smallest space and Gauteng is the smallest province, it is the financial hub of the country. That is where all the industries are making the money. That's where the financial institutions are, and people are under the impression that that is where the jobs are.
Yeah.
So that's the main reason why people influx themselves into the urban spaces of Gauteng and those type of spaces.
Yeah.
And it's true that Joburg in general has a land space issue. There isn't enough space for development to accommodate people, which is why the city of Johannesburg as a municipality have recognized this and have implemented or created policies and have started to implement policies where they encourage higher density development within the city. And this is throughout the city. It's not, clustered in areas where there's high density people. It's throughout the city. It's a way to create, it's a way to make public transport also more viable. So the other issue on infrastructure is the city also has a development contributions policy where every single town planning application, every single development is charged development contributions to improve the infrastructure. And the onus is then obviously on the local government to implement it in the correct way. And then also, like, certain developments are told to do certain upgrades. So sometimes, there's an intersection that needs to be upgraded. The pipes beneath the land need to be upgraded, and that's the job for the developer, and that's the cost for the developer. So those things work hand in hand. In terms of utilizing space better, my personal view is that we need to start using space in a different way, where we create multifunctional spaces where people can use spaces for more than one use. So in a school, like one of the callers had said that there's been multiple schools developed in Alex. Those schools can be used for multifunctional spaces. Those fields can be community fields on the weekends. The halls can be community halls. And that way the community develops in a better way. Everybody takes ownership of the spaces. There's a better quality of life that's derived out of that sort of situation. But that's my view on creating better spaces.
Okay, so this is about urban planning, communal living, and innovation, Professor Hope, is what Raisa Sumar is raising. Is that, first you try to address the housing issue, then you try to make sure that the infrastructure matches what we're talking about, and then you find the communal spaces, because you're going to have to use communal spaces for social activities, and that way people feel invested in the community. Even when she began, she started off earlier off by saying This idea that when you own something, you own a piece of land, you own your house with a garden, you can also own your apartment, sectional title ownerships, and that a lot of the development agencies for social housing should be coming on board with some of these programs of assistance. Professor Hope?
Hello?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I agree with my colleague. I think we're sharing the same line of thinking. We need to do communal development. We need to make sure that we bring everyone on board. But also, while doing that, you must understand that what's happening in the country is that they want to fix one problem, and everyone sees that the services and everything's happening there, then people, they will also go there. So you keep getting people coming to the same place. And this is what's happening across the country, even with informal settlement. So we need to work around how are we going to regulate these people's movement. And the best way to regulate this movement is what I said earlier about to say, we need to understand why people are moving. And therefore, we need to not give people an option to move because they're desperate. People, they just have to move because maybe they're going to visit a friend or a relative, but not because they're desperate. And you must remember, since apartheid, we've opened our cities, and we said everyone can stay anywhere in South Africa, which is correct. Mm-hmm. But now what we've dealt with is that when people come with small cities, where are we going to house these people? So, and that is why we're looking at the crisis. So we've opened the cities without deliberating on the housing system and the production or how they're going to house these people.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Sibotsa in Midrand, you've got a view?
Morning, Ausilerato.
Ndate, go ahead.
Yeah, my view, the way that I see, Alexandra can be turned into a very serious business place, where the title deed holders, they can work along with the government for Alexandra to be developed, so that it can no longer be small houses. It can be flats, whereby those shacks that are in Alexandra, they can be removed. There will be enough space for parking, and flats they can be built, and title deed holders can work along with the government to be the stakeholders in the business place. That place can be a very serious, it can turn into a very serious business place, but it will need government to intervene in that. We know it will cost government to develop the infrastructure, the piping, and all those things. But it's something that it can be done, and it can be professionalized, where government can bring the regulations that there will be no sheds allowed in Alexandra. It can turn into a very beautiful place.
Okay, you said Alexandra can turn into a business hub. Now, remember the numbers we spoke about: 800 hectares, right? 500,000 homes. So what people need urgently is to be resettled into homes, whether they're apartment blocks. Obviously, when we're talking homes, there's going to be more schools that are needed and more clinics and health centers. So those become the first social priorities. Where would then the business hub emerge? What do you envisage the business hub would look like? Is it a mall, trading spaces? What is in your head as you're thinking about it?
We will be having enough space. Remember, the houses are built on the ground, but when we talk about flats, we go higher.
Up.
And then we go up. When we go up, the space will remain on the ground, and that space where we will have a mall and all those things, the space will be available. So the town planners can come and do the different roads, and space will be available. There is a huge space and time if people want to do it.
Okay, Raima Suma, I'm gonna throw the question at you, but I'm not going to ask you to answer it. I'm going to say to you, if you had to reimagine Alexandra, just based on what you're hearing Abut Sibotsa saying about build up, but also use the available space, not just for community centers, but for economic activity and business hubs, what would your vision be? But I'm going to give you time to think about it as I go to Professor Hope Magidimisha Chipungo, and I say he's also raising an issue of informal settlements. He used shacks, but apparently in Alexandra, you don't just have so many families congregating in one yard or living in one yard. You've also got the mushrooming of informal settlements. So even if they build RDP homes and low-cost homes, informal settlements start emerging around those homes. It's said that there's at least 20 informal settlements in and around Alexandra. And in the section called Stradler, I'm reading here from News 24, there are 7 squatter camps alone. And Stradler is a small section just next to Marlborough. So even when people build, the informality kicks in as well.
Yes, because the principal decision here, ideology, is that people do not have houses in South Africa. And most people that don't have houses, and there will be a home to stay. And if you look where Alexandra is, and the opposite, we always talk about this in town planning, where Alexandra is estimated to Sandton. So it's a question of survival. Everyone wants to be within the city. Everyone wants to survive. And they will do everything and nothing to make sure that they've got a shelter. So shelter as an informal settlement, it's not a problem on its own, but it's a symptom of the bigger problem that we have in the country, which I keep emphasizing. We do not have housing. So that we should expect is going to happen, is going to continue to happen, because as it stands now, it's not very clear what is our strategy as a country to deal with informality. How we're going to address all this informal settlement, which is mushrooming across our city. Not just in Gauteng, but also in Durban, in Cape Town, all over the country. So if you did not come up with this strategy, people, they will continue looking for accommodation. And of course, that puts us more, because such accommodation is not sustainable. So we need to start both innovating and come up with a different housing production system that we're able to offer different options. As it is, of course, we talk about RDP that we are offering people in South Africa, which, of course, they also have their own problems as it relates to quality. But the ideology behind it is a good one to give people houses. But also, there are also people who, if you give them a piece of land, they will build their own houses. And we should actually advance that, because it's not everyone who's waiting for the houses to be built for them. There are some who are just waiting to be given a piece of land to build their own houses. Because a piece of land in South Africa is a gold, it's very expensive. So ordinary South African at the lower spectrum, that's what both afford. So I think we need to come up, we have to introduce variety of housing, so that people, they can able to pick what best suits them.
Okay. Silence and Centurion, you've got a question?
Loreto, it's a comment. I stayed in Alexandra for almost 5 years, and I can tell you that the truth that is not told is that those people who are staying in Alexandra, even if you build houses there, you're not going to resolve the problem. Let me tell you why. Because if you want to tell them that there is a land identified somewhere, they don't want to move from that Alexandra, because they've been staying together for quite some time. And if you want to relocate them, I can tell you what is going to happen is that they will accept the house, rent it, and go back to Alexandra. Because they said they don't want to move out of Alexandra. And to build a house there, it means that others need to be relocated. And that is the problem that the government is facing now. It's just unfortunate that the truth is not told. Most people in Alexandra, they don't want to move out of Alexandra. They want you to build where it's congested, and of which the professors that are there will tell you that for you to be able to plan properly, it means others must move out so that the land can accommodate those that are there. Otherwise, you won't resolve that problem, Lerato, because those people, the political organization is fueled by a political organization like EFF to score points. But the truth on the ground, they won't tell you why they cannot do that. It's because of Alexandra residents don't want to move out of Alexandra. I was staying there, I'm talking about what I know. That's why even Tate Obafone said the same thing, that the people who are not the Alexandra residents who don't have title deed here must be the ones that move out. That is the fight that is there, that who must move out.
Okay.
Yeah, that's where the problem is.
So, Dr. Silence, before you go silent, do you agree that the people who must move out, if that was the solution, and be resettled on other private lands, are the ones without the title deeds, that the people with the title deeds should have the first preference?
I agree with that, because they are the ones that got those ones who stayed in Alexandra. So they are the first. It's a FIFO method. First in, out, first in, out, first out.
Last in,
like
first out. Okay, thank you.
Something
Thank
like
you.
that. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Well, let's not, obviously people have now created homes, families. They have a sense of community now. They might not be the original dwellers, but they are now the residents of Alexandra. So I'm not sure if the move them out, resettle them is going to be palatable politically, especially when South Africa's got a history of forced removals. So Firetown, District 6, I think emotionally some of those things might be triggering. But Raisa Suma, let's bring you in and say, let's imagine everybody can stay in what they now call their home, Alexandra. What would that look like?
So I think in order to sort the housing crisis out, we need to understand it in a bigger context. It's by providing houses, we're not solving the problem. The problem is employment, and it's once we understand that, then we can create housing opportunities for people closer to employment. So Alex is a space that's well connected. It's next to industrial areas. It's next to Sandton, which is a financial hub. It's next to many other residential areas. So the location is great. But the people living in Alex, most of them are unemployed as well. So we need to create employment opportunities. And within Alex, one of your callers said something about creating a business hub. I understand his perspective because, for people to live in a space, they need to be able to go get their groceries from a short distance, walking distance away. I can go to school, I can go to the shops, I can go to a clinic. So in order to fix Alex, I would think it needs to be multi-story spaces in a utopian world where, the ground floor is shops. It can be medical consulting rooms. It can be offices also for some, certain professions, legal professions, accountants, whatever it is. The second, third, fourth floors, you have residential units of different sizes. So that accommodates people with different affordability statuses. So you have 1 bedrooms, you have studios, you have 3 bedrooms for families and whatnot. And then within those blocks, we create open spaces. So internally, people have open spaces, for kids to play in. There are safe spaces that are enclosed almost, that people tend to look into, So you have like some sort of level of security that's created just by having people living around you.
Okay.
And that's what would be my utopian view. You have multiple blocks like that, and people can live in harmonious ways.
And very briefly, Professor Magidimisha Chipungu, best practice, if city councillors and politicians are not sure how to fix it, where can they look and see they did it here, you can do it?
Yeah, the first example after the world to put into, but why I'm reluctant to actually refer them to some of those examples because South Africa's situation is a very unique one. It's got apartheid, it's got so the culture within South Africa, the way in which we relate with one another, it's a completely different. But what also happens is that I think we need to understand that the bigger problem is not houses as such. That is a symptom of the problem that we have, that of unemployment.
A lot of unemployment.
That of land availability. We need to fix that.
Thank you.
And create job opportunities.
Thank you. Okay, so better planning and create jobs. And when the two go hand in hand, Alexandra might be a solution, might find solutions. Raisa Suma, town planner, thank you very much. She's the director of Suma & Co, professional town planners, and Professor Hope Magidimisha Chipungu, professor at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. It's been the Monday edition of Power Talk. We'll do it again tomorrow.
You've been listening to a Power 98.7 podcast. For more podcasts, visit power987.co.za or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.